Pheko, this is the backdrop against which the president is making this decision, which we'll hear about in about half an hour or so when the president addresses the nations. Millions of South Africans will be tuning in to that address by the president to get more clearer answers on the national lockdown and conditions around relaxation of some regulations. Some are expecting that. A draft proposal explaining a 5-stage alert system to ease lockdown regulations that was presented to Cabinet on Monday has been leaked, apparently. President spokesperson Khusela Diko confirming the authenticity of the document, but saying that it was outdated and had been prepared as early input into the development of risk-adjusted approach to resuming economic activity. Telling a newspaper this, some pundits are saying the documents lend credence to the stark reality that crippling restrictions are going nowhere. Let's speak now to political economist and senior research fellow at Trade Collective, Ms. Lebohang Pheko. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. So, just looking at that 5-point plan outline at the various levels, to your mind, what would be the key driving forces or factors?
Thank you very much. I think the one thing is we have to be able to mediate the notion of getting back to work and getting the economy working again with the fact that there's still a public health crisis taking place. And I think that even though there's this whole 5-point plan has also been it's really a global template that many people, that many countries have been using in order to try to race the two twin horrors, which are, collapsing populations and health, diminishing health, and of course the collapsing economy. And the two are very much interfacing. I think another thing is just to ensure that the whole, the testing has to continue, the preventative measures have to continue, but also there has to be a relaxation to some extent or a realignment of what is being called the informal sector. I prefer to call the parallel sector for various reasons. The one point is that there's a very real crisis of food shortages or food security in people's households. This is probably causing a great amount of discomfort and necessarily so. Remember that initially spaza shops or small scale retailers in many communities, especially African townships, African-based townships, were the ones which were said to be the closest retailers, possible retailers for many people in those communities to access, especially given that taxi services and other public forms of transport have been hampered and have been suspended. So it's a bit of a catch-22 when those places of supply of retail cannot be accessed. So I would see that assuring the based communities that they are able to access the basics. People are literally fearful that they're going to starve to death, and they're also willing to do anything at the moment to ensure that this doesn't happen. And we've seen that in place in Malawi, parts of Nigeria, and so on, even across parts of Asia, where people are getting extremely unhappy with the length of time that it is taking for this pandemic to turn around. And that's nobody's fault, but certainly states have to appreciate that the working poor, the working class, and people, communities in high density, low income or even no income communities are not going to be able to endure this for much longer.
And speaking of that desperation, we just saw in those visuals from my colleague earlier on in Soweto of people who are being sold meat that's gone off. We've seen some riots in the Western Cape. What does that speak to in terms of the distributive measures that are in place or that have been announced to mitigate some of these circumstances?
Well, the few suggestions I think that have emerged over the past while, certainly the one is that the massive bottlenecks even in supermarkets. Attempts to enforce social distancing have not been very successful. But more importantly than that, the small-scale farmers have been hampered as well during this time. And these effects of the lockdown were felt immediately. Surprisingly, many of us may not be aware that a lot of the farmers in this country are actually African farmers. So we usually focus on the large-scale white cartels, the traditional historical white cartels, and who are symbolic of so many things. Some of them quite negative, but they're actually many black farmers, African farmers, but just over 170 or 180,000 of them. And they are the ones actually who are able to have access to communal areas, smaller farm holdings, and where a lot of the downsized agricultural work happens. And that's a much closer redistributive factor to urban areas and peri-urban areas, or so-called township farming, because these, number one, also involve, places like BLAS, Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies, have done excellent work in this regard, which involve really important supply chain arrangements with some of the restaurants and the hotels. But they also supply to smaller retailers in communities directly, and cutting out the middle person. Small-scale fishers have also been, their distribution mechanisms have also been hampered. And I think, again, the same sort of model, which would be a much more direct from producer to the end consumer model, which they use, is extremely important. Farm workers are also at risk at a time like this, and even though we've been saying that we are a food-secure country, we're certainly seeing that we're not able to keep up with supply, not because there isn't enough to go around, but because the distributive measures have not been well thought out institutionally and at state level.
So, what interventions can the president make, and can there be an easing of measures if we're talking about food security, the tangibles and intangibles?
Yeah, so I think the one is certainly to get parallel economy working, in a very quick way, in a very particular way. It would be very useful to ensure that some of the small-scale, the spaza shops and some of the smaller retailers are able to get some kind of relief. I think the second piece is somewhere within these, the COVID pandemic fund, which was announced 2 nights ago, there has to be a mechanism for a much quicker turnaround to redistribute this to people who have either not able to get UIF, for companies which are not registered. And that's a huge thing, because you have to appear on the tax base and be in good tax standing in order to qualify. And of course, many small businesses, small entrepreneurs are not because they're bad people, but just because sometimes that's just the nature of smaller businesses, and some of the regularities are often put to the side. And I think that's the second thing, that there has to be a level of of forgiveness in this instance, whereby when people approach the necessary authorities, they will not be punitive. They will not be punitive, retributive action, but rather a much more supportive approach to this. I think thirdly, we also have to look at ways in which we begin to see how we can support a different way of redistributing educational materials to communities. I'm very concerned about, of course, the classist inclination of assuming that everybody has access to online learning. This is a whole academic year potentially that is being that some children may have to may have to write off. And I think for many communities, many families, paying a whole other year of fees is really, really, after a year, given that there will also be a period of economic recovery, loss of income, is really, really very difficult. So there has to be a whole different way of realigning the notion of recovery. And it can't be a thing of we all decide we're going to go and walk, celebrate at the stadium and watch Chiefs and Pirates and go to Chisanyama and do the things that we would really love to do on a Saturday night. But we need to think very carefully about the balancing the hemorrhaging economy with the fact that people are still, the curve is still just too high for us to go back on that.
Okay. So we're going to continue the discussion with Lebohang Pheko, a political economist, especially on those resource constraints, and if there is an easing and lifting of the restrictions of COVID-19 regulations, which industries, which sectors would provide immediate relief to the economy. Those are just some of the issues that we'll examine later on. A look at your headline.